Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Bob, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hi, I'm Bob Levin. I've writ wrote a book about Dan O'Neill and the Air Pirates called The Pirates and the Mouse, published by Fantagraphics in 2003, currently out of print, but copies are available online pre-owned.
Now, who exactly is Dan O'Neill, and how'd you come across this person?
Okay, well, I'd been writing about underground and alternative cartoonists for several years. I was not a comic book person at the time I started writing about cartoonists, but I live in Berkeley, and the Bay Area had been the center for the underground cartoonist movement of the late 60s. And when I started to write about them, a lot of them still lived here, even though the scene had basically dried up. And they were all, if I called them up and said, "Hey, I want to come interview you," um, they were basically come on over because nobody was paying any attention to them then. And it wasn't like I was trying to interview a rock star or a movie star. And they were all bright and funny and wacky. And it was, just great. And they had all the same problems and issues as any artists did. So it was great fun. And along the line, I heard that there was this group of underground cartoonists called the Air Pirates, who were wild and woolly, even by the standards of the underground, which is a pretty wild and woolly bunch. And their ethos was that their contribution to the counterculture and the revolution was going to be the destruction of Walt Disney. So they had put out a couple comic books called Air Pirates Funnies, where they had taken Disney characters and put them into very un-Disney-like situations, and then basically um, dared Disney to sue them, and Disney did. Disney was, and I thought, well, this is a good story. The leader of this group was a cartoonist named Dan O'Neill, and one of the leading distributors of underground comic books was a guy named Don Donahue who lived in Berkeley. He had a mailing list where he would sell underground comic books, and he lived in a loft where he was basically lined with boxes and boxes of underground comics. And so if I had met Don, and if there was somebody I wanted to write about, I'd go over to his place and he would sell me the books, and he had everybody's phone number. So he gave me Dan O'Neill's phone number, which, as I recall, wasn't working. It took me a while to track him down. Dan was then living up in Nevada City, where he's lived for a number of years, which is in the Sierra foothills. And by the time I reached him, he said, "Yeah, it's time somebody told our story. Come on up." So my wife and I drove up to Nevada City, and after some trouble, we located Dan and sat down with him and talked. And he was a charming fellow, a great storyteller. Uh, his stories have to often be taken with a grain of truth. And anyway, I wrote an article about the air pirates in Disney. And I never had so much fun writing anything in my life. And I thought this should be a book. So I expanded it and got a book out of it. And Fantagraphics, I wrote it for the Comics Journal, which is a magazine that Fantagraphics published. It was basically a monthly, maybe 10 issues a year. And were publishing books too, and they published the book. And their thing sat, yeah. So that's how I got to meet Dan.
Now, before we get into the air pirates, like, what's your thought on the counterculture at the time? Like, were you in amazement of it? Because I'm happy at it's like a David and Goliath story with Dan O'Neill, but there's really like trying to attack the not the establishment, but just throw rock at someone, the capitalist system, I would say. And I can really appreciate that, especially from a ground roots movement, which I think the counterculture was. But obviously, I don't know the impact of Disney back then. Like, how huge, how conflicted could you be with like you got Disney on one hand, and then you're love for the counterculture on the other.
Well, like Disney at that point they were grossing $100 million a year. Um, when I was a kid, like Disney was a major cultural presence. Like every time a movie would come out, it would be something you had to see, and your parents would take you to it. And then for kids, it stayed with you for a while. Um, Eventually, like after animation and the popularity of their movies, in my sense, sort of fell off. They put out a ton of crappy, unforgettable movies that nobody I knew went to see. But by then we were older, and it was like, I don't know if kids were seeing it then, but certainly teenagers weren't going to Disney
Yeah.
movies. And the two big things that Disney came along with in the 50s, where they got into television with the weekly show, I forget what that was called, Disney World or something. That was a good show. I mean, I was still attracted to that. And then Disneyland, which was a big thing to see. Um, the Mickey Mouse Club I was too old for, and by the time you got to be a teenager, you had a lot of other interests other than Disney. But for the Air Pirates, particularly O'Neill, they were representative of the 50s and the culture and America and America and a society that the counterculture was rebelling against. Disney was seen as supporting American imperialism. It was very patriotic. It was, conformity, everybody in a Mickey Mouse cap hat,
Still like that today.
obey your teachers, obey the authorities, uh, unquestioning patriotism is good. The FBI is your friend. All this stuff was, consumerism, spend money. All this was part of the Disney culture as the Air Pirates saw it. And
But was Dan and his air pirates the only people at the time that recognized that Disney was like this? Because even today, it's still like there's people out there that seem like they're on drugs or something that are like, Disney's everything, Disney's the world. And I'm like, oh my goodness, like they've done so much horrible things. And look, I love Disney movies as much as the next person, but there's like not a balanced discussion about it. So I'm curious if this was the first time that the counterculture has ever attacked
wasn't
someone
wasn't
like
the
Disney.
first time.
Wasn't?
The first one I remember was Paul Krasner. You know Paul Krasner? He edited The Realist, which was this sporadically published magazine that cheap newsprint magazine that would come out, and it was a savage satirical magazine about all things. And at one point he hired the great EC comic book artist and alcoholic Wally Wood to do a two-page spread called, after Disney died, called the Walt Disney Memorial Orgy. And Wood took all these characters and spread them all out over a two-page spread in the Realist, doing all this licentious, druggy stuff. And then some guy pirated that and put out a poster. Wood did it anonymously. And then this guy in San Francisco, I think, put out a poster of it. And that was like in dorm rooms and all that stuff. And then I also, in my research, came across an episode where the hippies or the yippies decided that the way to celebrate the, what would it have been, 25th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, to stage a protest at Disneyland. And a bunch of hippies drugged out came charging into Disneyland in Anaheim. And the park was, there were a couple dozen arrests, no brutality that I could find, but and the park was shut down for the only other time it was shut down was in when Kennedy was killed.
Yeah.
So Disney, was in some people's sights. I mean, I'm 28 in 1970. That's when the Air Pirates come around, and in my crowd, nobody mentioned the word Disney. I mean, you could be anti-war and pro-civil rights and pro this and that, but Disney wasn't a major conscience presence.
Did you ask Dan if he knew what he was doing at the time he was doing it? Like,
Oh
it's
yeah,
kind of like yeah.
Dan. This was Dan's thing. Some of the other air pirates, there were five of them: Dan O'Neill, Ted Richards, Shari Flanagan, Bobby London, and Gary Holgren. And it was Dan's thing. Some of the others, liked, said, okay, we like it. It's a good idea. It's a goof. We're going along with it. As I recall, Bobby London always disassociated himself from it and has regrets to this day about it. The other people, are proud to have been a part of it. Um,
But did he realize he was attacking a sacred cow with the whole Disney thing?
I'm sorry.
Did he realize he was attacking a sacred cow with the
Oh
whole
yeah, that
Disney
was
thing?
the
Yeah.
point of it for Dan.
I know that's so dangerous, man.
Let me back up a little about Dan. Okay, tell you who Dan was. Um,
There's like three groups I don't want to mess with. It's Bill Clinton at all. Just don't even touch that. You'll end up mysterious. There's Disney and then there's Scientology. Those are like the three that are like no-goes.
well, first, like Dan was a college dropout, dropped out of several colleges, according to him. He never graduated college, but he'd been working as a professional cartoonist since he was 15. Little newspapers, first in Berkeley, then when his family moved up to Nevada City, and then he got a deal with the San Francisco Chronicle. And at 21, the Chronicle hired him to do this strip of his creation called Odd Bodkins. And he became the youngest syndicated newspaper cartoonist in American history. And Odd Bodkins was this, it began as a kind of offbeat, little strange humor strip and became more and more offbeat and stranger as it developed. That eventually Dan was running, like right next to Mary Worth, a strip that was pro-drug and anti-war. And newspaper after newspaper was dropping hit the strip, and eventually, because of the controversy, the Chronicle fired him. And then there was such a protest in the Bay Area that they rehired him. And then Dan kept up his provocations, and they fired him again. And this time he decided, okay, he was done with newspapers. He was going into the underground comic world. And towards the end of his strip, he was putting Walt Disney characters into the strip, which the Chronicle didn't like. Disney was a notoriously litigious company. They had recognized early on that they had very valuable properties in their characters that they could create, and they could put them on all kinds of products and make a lot of money, and that they were ripe for people ripping them off. So every time they had the least little bit of a wrinkle that somebody was using one of their characters improperly, they would send them a cease and desist letter. And if they didn't, they would hit them with a massive lawsuit and try to, and the bigger the villain they seemed, the scarier they probably thought they were, and the less and less people would mess with them. So when the Air Pirates comics come out, they get 2 issues out, and then Disney hits them with this 17 cause complaint, seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages, and they figure that's the end of it. These guys can't afford to fight us. So O'Neill then goes out and he gets the creme de la creme of the San Francisco counterculture bar to represent the Air Pirates. And they think they're work pro bono. They didn't know they were going to be working pro bono, but they end up working pro bono on this lawsuit defending the Air Pirates. It goes on for 15 or 20 years. Eventually, it goes through the District Court of Appeal, Ninth Circuit, gets appealed to the Supreme Court, who denies cert, and they're stuck with this, $190,000 judgment against them. Now, 2 of the Air Pirates had settled by this point. O'Neill's still going, and then the first thing O'Neill does was he gets he had a friend named Stuart Brand who put out the Whole Earth catalog, and he had a magazine called the Coevolution Quarterly, and he gave Dan 4 pages to do a strip in which Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse tell the story of the Air Pirates litigation, which is to Disney, that's like a direct affront, breaking the injunction, which was they can't use Disney characters anymore. And here he goes. So now they want him held in contempt and thrown in jail. And that's when so it was quite a story.
Now, what exactly pissed off Disney to the point where they wanted to sue him in the first place? Was it because he had Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse going down on each other or something
They
like
didn't
that?
want the unauthorized use of their characters, for one thing. That's a violation of what they felt was their copyright rights, that they had copyrighted these characters and you can't use them without our permission, except for, there are exceptions to what is called the fair use exception. Like if you're going to review something, you can quote a limited portion of that and you don't have to get permission from the copyright holder. But if you're going to take a character from a comic book and put him in a comic book without permission of the copyright holder, you're acting, that's risky behavior. And they also didn't like the fact that what they were doing with the characters, the way they had them behaving, like they saw Disney as, its brand, to use a current word, was wholesome family entertainment. And this was like a threat to the brand, to conceive of Mickey and Minnie having sex, having oral sex, to conceive of Bucky Bug having to sexually gratify a centipede with 50 clitorises was an affront to the Disney, worldview. The whole idea of, obscene behavior, pornographic behavior, the threat to the society is that it's a threat to the fabric of the society and moral decency, and it brutalizes our sensibilities, and therefore we have to keep people from writing about or making pictures of this stuff, which some people find offensive. So they went after him, and the Air Pirates' point of view, or the lawyer's point of view, and Dan's point of view was, look, I'm a satirist. Dan fervently believed that, well, I had a good quote from Dan. You know, something that, politicians are lawyers, thieves, and killers, and only the cartoonist is the last line of defense against them. Speaking truth to power. That was Dan O'Neill. And so I'm a satirist, and I speak in cartoons. And for my satire to have punch and have bite and have impact, I have to draw the character as close to the real character as possible. The more I deviate, the more it weakens my satire. So like, Disney would say, well, you can make whatever point you want, but you can't use our characters. And Dan was using your characters as the whole point, because I'm going to voice my opposition to the view you're trying to foist on innocent children, and which you foisted on me and my fellows when we were growing up, and we found out that was, a crock of shit. The world wasn't like you said. Anyway.
Doesn't that boil down to his right with like his First Amendment? Because if you're talking about having his voice through art, I mean, that's his voice and he's trying to express himself and they're trying to limit him from using his voice.
Yeah, but the First Amendment, has limitation.
Everything has limitations. Everything has got
The
limitations.
First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, blah blah blah, abridging these rights. But you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. That came along. You don't have the right to incite a riot. You don't have the right to slander or defame somebody. And you have copyright laws. So without to say you have an unbridled First Amendment right, Disney would argue, and other people would argue, would be to emasculate copyright laws for literature, music, movies.
Didn't he get an exemption where he could do one single use? Like, so if he printed out, didn't he get an exemption where he could use one single use of one of the characters in a art form? Dan, there was a documentary on YouTube where Dan talked about if he could create one work, then there was 25,000 that he would have to throw out. So then what he did was he got, I think, 15,000 or 10,000 people to all draw one work depicting the Disney characters.
Yeah, yeah, I know, but
So smart.
one should not go to Dan O'Neill for legal advice.
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't
You
take it
can
as legal
rely, if you
advice. I just
rely
thought it
on,
was,
I mean, Dan's a wonderful person and a great character, but you don't seek him out for legal advice. I know he's said that. It's in my book, and that's wrong. Nobody. He also says that he won the case.
he didn't win the case. I thought he did. Did he get
No,
jail time?
he was enjoined from ever using a Disney character again, and he has $190,000 verdict against him,
Holy shit.
which still stands. I mean, he's not supposed to violate their copyrights anymore. Whether they bother going after him at this point, he's 82 years old. I mean, he'll draw you a Mickey and Minnie.
I'm gonna have to get one from
Doing a nasty deed. I've got one on my wall.
him.
I think he charges $25 or $50 at conventions, and he'll draw it for you.
When you were talking with him, did he have any regrets about anything that he did? He seems like a guy that's very stood in his stance on things.
No, Dan, I think I quote Dan as saying he once on his tombstone that I had too much fun. He doesn't admit to any regrets. I mean, this is a guy who every time he had a chance at success, he either deliberately or unintentionally shot himself in the foot. The Chronicle had him back, and he left the Chronicle, and he's been offered this deal or that deal, and he's just out having a good time, you know, living his life. As I said, he's 82 now.
I mean, that's different than what we usually see from a lot of people out there. It's easier to take the safe route, especially if you need a job to survive. But if you really just believe in having the ultimate experience and wanting to kind of keep doing what you want to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a mix of free will, intent, and then there are certain psychological drives or complexities which may interfere and limit what you're able to do. I mean, of the air pirates, um, financially speaking, probably Dan was the least successful. Sherry Flanagan, who wasn't involved in the lawsuit because she didn't have anything in the two Air Pirates books. She had a long career at the National Lampoon, both as a cartoonist and as an editor. Bobby London had a long career, may still be drawing cartoons. He did the Popeye strip for a while. He's worked for Nickelodeon. Gary Holgren, I think, what was the strip he took over? He took over a newspaper strip. Um, it slipped in my mind for a while, and worked his whole life as a cartoonist, illustrator. And Ted Richards, I guess, was the most interesting because he continued on in cartooning for a while, and then he got into Silicon Valley and became a web designer, and was very successful. Um, and worked on the Genome Project, and
Yeah.
worked for Atari. And he's one of the only cartoonists to really transition into the corporate world.
Well, speaking from a personal perspective, what did you feel about the Air Pirates? How did you feel about their impact? Do you believe it was good? Do you believe it was bad?
I was I was not an objective reporter when I wrote my book. I was charmed and won over by the Air Pirates and their case. And I think, ultimately, and the law came to accept the Air Pirates' point of view. I think, the the case begins with, when I was working on my book, there was a case against that Mattel Corporation brought against an artist who took Barbie dolls and placed the Barbie dolls in sexually explicit positions. What was the name of that case? 2001.
God, to be the judge in that room that has to
Tom
preside over that.
Forsyth was the artist, um, and the Ninth Circuit upheld his right to fulfill his artistic vision through the placement of Barbie dolls in sexually explicit positions in order, quote, to critique the materialistic and gender oppressive values he believed they represented. And that's what the Air Pirates were doing. Now they were a little too blatant and a little too far ahead of their times, and the courts are uncomfortable, still very uncomfortable with sexually blatant material, and the distinction that developed in copyright law when it came to satire or infringement of copyrights in artistic ventures was, and I may have the words wrong, but it's, are you seeking to basically duplicate the original? Like if you took Mickey Mouse and put him on a T-shirt that said, it was just Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse and a T-shirt, that would be a violation of Disney's copyright because you're trying to pass your T-shirt off as a Disney
Yeah.
product. But if you take Mickey Mouse and put him in a situation where you're not like competing with Disney in a purely artistic thing, like Disney tended to leave alone fine artists who would put Disney like in, characters in a big painting to hang on a wall in a gallery and sell for $500,000. In fact, there were rumors that Disney used to try to get Andy Warhol or other people to use their characters.
Because it
But
boosts up their image of their character.
yeah, what was, let me look, if you give me a second so I
Yeah, man,
can
take your
look
time.
at get the term right.
I can only imagine an Andy Warhol version of Mickey Mouse compared to me trying to draw Mickey Mouse. I'm pretty sure they'd be way more upset with me doing it. But if I even tried to draw Mickey Mouse, it would come out like Felix the Cat. So,
I can do Mickey Mouse. Dan showed me how to do Mickey Mouse. You take a quarter, you draw a line around the quarter, you take a dime, you put half the dime at one ear, put the other half a dime at the other ear, a quarter, a dime, another federal crime. That's how Dan would sign stuff.
Dan sounds like an interesting person.
um, yeah, whether are they trying to supersede the original in the market? Are they trying to transform it into something new? That's what the court said in the Pretty Woman case. That was a Supreme Court decision where Live 2 Crew, the rap group,
Yeah.
took the song Pretty Woman and sampled it, and the copyright holders refused to give them permission. And that went to the Supreme Court, and Live 2 Crew won because they were transforming the original. And with the Air Pirates, they argued all along, look, nobody's going to mistake this for a Disney comic book. It's not sold where Disney comics are sold. It's sold in head shops. It's the people who are going to buy it are not kids who are Disney fans. It's drugged out hippies who are underground comic fans. There's going to be no impact on Disney's market share. And Disney's, well, of course it's going to harm our market share. It's defaming our characters. It's, making them look, it's, grotesque, perverted. How can it not harm our market share?
Did Disney have a lot of support from Disney fans and other people? Like, was it a well-known story that this was all happening, Dan's court case and everything? Or Disney likes to keep things quiet?
I don't think it was really well known at the time. I mean, the book had appealed to three groups of people. One was fans of underground comics. Another was fans of Disney. And the third group, which really surprised me, was people in the intellectual properties field liked it. It even got into law libraries, um, which I got a particular kick out of because I was a lawyer in my professional life, but I was not a particularly distinguished law student. So I don't know. I mean, I ran not too long ago. I ran into a guy who'd been an animator for Disney for 20 years, who hated Disney. He couldn't wait to read my book.
Now, you creating a work on Disney, did Disney happen to reach out to you at all about this? Because they do that a lot with people who make books, even. Okay.
The publisher, was leery about it, but Fantagraphics is a very gutsy publishing house, and they had no qualms about doing it. I think there would have been other publishing houses that wouldn't have done the book. I think I think there were places that wanted to stay away from it and were, afraid of Disney. There still are. I mean, now that Mickey Mouse, at least in the incarnation of Steamboat Willie, is in the public domain, there's suddenly been more interest in Disney. Like somebody from Variety interviewed me. You put me in a podcast. There's a documentary filmmaker who's seriously considering making a film, if he can get the funding, about Dan. I think the guy who made the video you're talking about is associated with that project, that film project. I had met him some time ago, and he was, I think now people are thinking it's more of a chance to take, Disney will leave them alone, and the book's been out for 20 years, and I never heard anything from Disney about it.
What about the Air Pirates operations? Like, where did they have a warehouse? Did they have a setup or
Oh,
something?
well, what happened was, I guess Dan had the other Air Pirates, going back up. The Air Pirates met at a rock and roll festival in Washington State over the Labor Day weekend in, I think, 1970. And over the next few months, Dan was in contact with one or two of them, and he got the idea of, let's have this organization, this group. But I don't know, the name Air Pirates supposedly comes from a group of people who bedeviled Mickey in the comic strip in the 30s, though the guy from Variety said he was never able to actually find a group called the Air Pirates. So I don't know. Anyway, Dan got the idea we should all come live together and learn to be cartoonists, and we're going to take on Disney. We're going to be our own publishing company. We'll publish our own books and support each other and learn from each other and exist like that. And they got it. So Flanagan was living in Seattle. Gary Holmgren, she was very involved in the anti-war movement and working for an underground newspaper there and doing illustrations. Gary Holmgren was a successful sign painter in Seattle. Ted Richards was an aspiring cartoonist working for the underground paper, the Berkeley Barb, and Bobby London was an aspiring cartoonist also working for the Berkeley Barb, and they all met at this festival. And eventually Dan assembled them all into this warehouse in San Francisco. And Dan was the father figure, if you will. He was 28. The others were, two of them were 20, two of them were 24, 25. And he was the professional. He was the only one who'd actually made a living as a cartoonist. And he had the skills and the ideas, and he became, so he set up this training program for them. They would each, take a classic, one of the great newspaper strip cartoonists, and develop a style on them, based on them, and they would use all different types of implements, to learn to master the craft of cartooning. And Dan had also spent several years of sort of apprenticing at the committee which was a satiric improv group on Broadway in San Francisco, during the post beat time of the late when would that have been? Dan starts at the Chronicle in '63. He's at the Improv throughout the '60s, and before the hippies really hit. The hippies come along around '66, '67. And Dan's got improv training, and he brings that training to the cartooning, and how they work together and try to help each other along and create situations that they have to work their way out of in the strips. And most of the cartoonists, found that quite a great experience, good experience. Most of them are very positive on the experience. But it got a little crazy. They're doing all sorts of drugs. They were living on very little money. They were under a lot of pressure from when the books come out from Disney, and behavior gets a little odd. And
When I guess
they were together, I think, for 7 months during 1970, and they got 2 books out during that time. And they had a third book, but Disney got that. Well, no, they got 2 Air Pirates books out. Then Gary Holgren came out with a book called The Tortoise and the Hare, which was, for some reason, Disney had not covered those 2 characters, Toby Tortoise and Max Hare, in their injunction. So Holgren, they did another book just using those, even though the injunction was in effect. But unfortunately, they stuck a Mickey Mouse in there somewhere. So that was a violation of the injunction. And got them back into court. So there were 3 books that came out. There was a third Air Pirates book, which was never published. Or it was in the works being developed to bring the story of the first 2 to a conclusion. But that one that was never published.
do you think for you it woke you up a little bit more to Disney and their power of things? A lot of people aren't really aware of Disney's connection and power.
Well,
Like, how can you not draw Mickey? How is that just, I understand like their whole background of understanding why their character is being put in these situations. But to me, it's so crazy how they have that much power to be like, do it and we'll sue you. And it's just like,
well, oh, the other thing I forgot to mention about Disney was Walt Disney himself, while perhaps a very nice man, was also a pretty right wing in his politics.
most billionaires were back then.
He was a supporter of UAC and the investigation into communism. He's, backed all the right wing Republican candidates in California, down to Reagan. Okay, well, I guess the most notorious example was there was a daycare center in Florida, which put a mural on their wall of Disney characters. And Disney sued them and made them take the mural down. That was like, there was no profit in it. It wasn't a threat to Disney, but Disney, you're using our characters. If we let you do it, then the next guy's going to come along and put them on T-shirts or whatever. So, and when you're looking at, when you look a small business person and some big shot comes along and says they're going to sue you, your choice is either to say, okay, I'll go change my name, or I'll change the mural on my wall, or get into litigation, which is going to cost you tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. One of the Disney lawyers, one of the Air Pirates, the lawyers, the only lawyer who had any actual experience in copyright law, was a colorful character named Albert Morse. And Morse became the attorney for a lot of underground cartoonists, and he was most successful with Robert Crumb. Crumb?
Yeah.
Mark Crumb? Okay. And the way Albert made a lot of money for Crumb was he would send people out to every little cockamamie trade show that was in the area and find somebody who was using one of Robert's images on a backpack or a bumper sticker, or a keep on trucking bong, or Mr. Natural T-shirt, and they would write the names down of all these people and come back to Albert, and Albert would send them a letter and said, you can't do that, you violated the Robert's copyright, send me $500 or $750, or we'll take you to court, and they would all pay off. And Crumb was making more money from that than he was from his comics during that period. And so with Disney, it was not, it was take your mural down or we'll sue you for $200,000.
What do you think the goal was of the air raid pirates? What do you think they were trying to
Air
really?
pirates, no,
Yeah,
not
air
raid.
pirates. Yeah, not raid. Sorry, but the air pirates. What do you think their goal was to really try and show people like the true image of Disney? Because you mentioned it at the beginning, but there is a thing that gets painted into you when you're a child and you grow up with Disney, and it is this kind of world that is perfect and it's centered around these types of values and these ideas. But then when you get older, you realize that that's kind of a fake. And it seems like as I've grown older, the counterculture's idea, even though as much as it might be provocative and a little bit out there, it's dead on with really hitting what the core element is, which is the capitalist imperialistic system.
Well, I think what they were after ranged from this is really fun. I'm being a wise ass, I'm a bad guy boy in school. I'm going to get some attention to I really seriously believe this. This ethos, really worked hell on me and my psyche, and I'm going to strike back against it and save poor other children from having to put up with this. I mean, most people, like you say, sort of outgrow it, and you learn something new. You learn what they were teaching us in school wasn't true, and I mean, the things that are being talked about and taught and written about in courses and college campuses today are certainly far different than when I was going to school in the 1960s. I mean, we still, we were coming out of World War II, and the United States was the good guys, and Vietnam. I graduated college in 1964, and Vietnam was just beginning, and the civil rights movement looked like it was making progress, and you sort of felt you were on this wave of history that was coming along, and everything was going to get better and better and better. And then very quickly you found out, whoa, we may be fucked. Um,
Did you ever ask Dan how he slipped into the underground comics network? Like, was it how he slipped into the underground comics network? Like, was it
well, he knew it
easily?
was there. He didn't hang out with many cartoon. I mean, he was a young guy starting out, and he didn't know any cartoonists. The only cartoonists he knew were older people, and he didn't like really fit in with what they represented or see himself doing that for the next 50 years. The underground was at first a little suspicious of him because he was already an established cartoonist. So he was like, you know, the Chronicle guy, this established guy, not, a rebel renegade, you know, Berkeley Barb guy or Berkeley Tribe guy. He had to earn his spurs, in fact, in the underground comics community.
Did you ever ask him if he had any regrets?
No, as I said, once on his tombstone he had how much fun he had.
When it comes to the underground comics, I mean, guess what interests you about just the underground counterculture in general, especially when it comes to their art, I always found very fascinating and it seems to resonate in particular with the times.
Well, as I said, I grew up uh, EC comics when I was a kid were my thing. And I was a card carrying, I like to say, EC fanatic. They had a fan club and I belonged and I had the card. And the comic book code came along when I was 12 and put EC out of business. And after that, I stopped reading comics. They had no interest in me. And I think that contributed to me becoming basically a First Amendment absolutist um, against. Um, and then when the underground came along in the late '60s, I was going to be an American novelist. I was a literature guy as well as a lawyer. I was into literature. I wasn't into comic books, so I didn't pay much attention to the underground. until I fell into this world of writing about them. And then I got, fascinated with them. And I found that I really liked artists who were sort of like, the more transgressive they were, the better. The fact that they were so daring and so free, um, I found that exciting. And I liked that they were challenging norms. I liked that they were advancing the art form. Um, and as the underground was sort of limited in that in terms of the verbal quality was pretty limited. I mean, it was basically sex, drugs, politics, and politics was really the third, the least of the underground comics. Um, and it took a while before the literary content, the verbal content of the comics or graphic novels developed and became of more interest, with, I guess, Love and Rockets was the first, though I never really, for some reason, got into Love and Rockets, but, certainly Mouse and thereafter, you know, the, the stuff, the content, verbal content that goes on in comics is rewarding as the verbal contact in a lot of novels. Though I read more novels than I read comics. If someone sends me a comic and says, "I think you might like this, Bob," or "Would you review this for me, Bob?" I'll take a look at it. And sometimes I find stuff that's really interesting. People hit me right. I'm still writing about comics, cartoonists.
The sex and drugs thing that was kind of taken off at the times, was that just because it was taboo? Like a lot of people obviously weren't. I know everyone goes, "Oh, it's a stereotypical hippie thing." I'm like, well, that's not true. There's a lot more value there for the hippies, but that is kind of like a very taboo subject, and particularly at that time as well, too.
Well, I mean, the 50s, which was what all the underground cartoonists were coming out of, was pretty repressive
Yeah.
in terms of sexual behavior and sex, what kind of sex was in literature and in the media. Um, and drugs were pretty, when I was going through college, there was a scandal my senior year of college, and 6 people were expelled because they were smoking marijuana. And that was like, whoa, the trustees were going to cut off money to the school. What kind of hellhole do you have there? And this was a liberal co-educational college. And I didn't know anybody who smoked marijuana until I got back to Philadelphia and after my first year of law school. Marijuana came along. I think it took another. I had heard about people taking LSD, but I didn't know anybody who had taken LSD. Um, and sex, well, when the pill came along, that made sex more common, easier. Um, but
Well, could I ask a
So it
personal
was like,
opinion?
why can't we put this in comic books? I mean, what sense does it make when you can have, when your superheroes can kill each other, but they can't have sex with each other? The
So that's a fair
code,
point.
the comic book code said, there were, banned certain words. You couldn't put the word terror or horror on the cover of a comic. You couldn't disrespect authority in a comic book. We had to protect children, even though some studies showed half of young adults were reading comic books. So it looks like what's the pressure cooker, came off and when I think about, well, what did the counterculture really establish culturally? Um, Sex and drugs with the change in sex and drugs, women's rights, yep, gay rights, amazing how that transformed. But the basic structure of the country, the imperialistic, capitalistic nature of the country is unchanged. Wealth discrepancy, last time I looked, it was about, it's about where it was 50 years ago. Um, Life expectancy, uh, about where it was 50 years ago. We haven't really like transformed the bases of the society to make it a more just, more fair, more equitable um, society as a whole.
Don't you think the counterculture, though, at least what was really kind of crafted out of it, was because that generation did experience a lot of trauma? I mean, you got the Vietnam War, you got JFK's death, RFK's death, MLK's death, Malcolm X. I mean, you have all these politically turmoil events that are happening all at once and in a short span of time as well, too. I mean, the Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg was able to expose really got people thinking about Vietnam in a different way. I mean, people, I wouldn't say we're a lot of people were kind of tuned out of it for a little bit. And there were people that were speaking out against the GIs in particular. But that's really when the public was like, hey, what the hell is going on here? And then you have Nixon coming aboard, and you have so many other things that are going on that just, it's a generation of trauma for those people.
I mean, I was a big Robert Kennedy guy, and the world would have been so much different. Well, I have a brother-in-law who's a historian who says, like the most consequential event of the 20th century was when the Archduke of Sarajevo, the chauffeur of his car, decided to turn left instead of right, and he went down the street where the assassin was waiting. If he'd gone the other way, the Archduke wouldn't have been assassinated. World War I wouldn't have happened. If World War I hadn't happened, World War II wouldn't have happened. If World War II hadn't happened, we wouldn't.
I said what was interesting about that era was the fact that you had mob figures that were walking the streets. You had people that were there was a whole lot going on between the press, the counter press, politically motivated stuff that was going on. You had different people taking political powers, whether it was Kennedy's assassination, whether it was RFK's assassination later, whether it was Nixon taking office, whether it was Jimmy Hoffa being brought into court, whether it was whatever. It's a time disconnected from today. We don't experience anything like that. That's why I find the 60s and 70s so fascinating. The people that lived through that and got to experience it, I don't know how, like, there's no Netflix series out there that could match to what people actually experienced in real life.
Well, we didn't have Donald Trump as president.
I guess when did the Air Pirates officially stop production on everything? When did it officially fade off and turn into everyone going their own separate directions?
Well, they were only together 7 months, and they only put out 3 comics.
But what was the official end where everyone decided we're just done?
I think they drifted apart during the middle to end of 1970. They went their separate ways. It's in the book. I don't think that's real consequential. Just to know that the lawsuit was going on. I think the injunction was the injunction in place. The preliminary injunction went into place in October. The books came out in July and August. The suit was filed in October, and the preliminary injunction was granted um, in November. And I think by then they had started to split up and disperse, though some of them were still around. Richard stayed around. Um, Sherry and Bobby London, I think, left. Holgren, not sure if
Was
he was still here or not.
Was there anything for you that you felt like you would like to ask or know about when it comes to the air pirates that might not have gotten to in your book or might not have gotten to in any of the interviews you did with Dan O'Neill or okay.
No, I was happy with it.
It's a good book. I like the language you use in it because I think it makes it more like someone's actually talking to me rather than me just reading something.
I thought I went a little too gonzo in certain
It's
places,
fine. I liked it.
and I would have liked more footnotes so I knew when I was some real footnotes so I knew where my quotes came from when I quote somebody. I thought, where did I take that from? I'd like to know that. I mean, I'm sure they were an accurate quote. I just didn't bother doing it. I'm going to have to cut out pretty soon.
I just got to
If you
ask you one more, and then I'll get you a second to be able to promote yourself. But out of all the people you interviewed, besides Dan O'Neill, who was someone that really stuck out in your mind as someone that gave you a lot of interesting information about the counterculture?
Well, not about the counterculture, but I mean, almost everybody was really happy to talk about this. You know,
Okay.
the lawyers on both sides, except for one guy who wouldn't talk to me, um, were, a pleasure to talk to. Um, I ended up on good terms with everybody except Bobby London, who didn't like something. I don't even remember what it was now. The way he came across in the Comics Journal article, um, he didn't like that. He didn't feel his point of view was fairly represented. He wouldn't talk to me after that, and so I couldn't get more information from him for the book. But everybody else was, a pleasure to talk to. Ted Richards and I stayed in touch um, through, till he died a year or two ago. Uh, Shari's publisher asked me to review. She had a collection of her cartoons come out from New York Review of Books Classics, and they asked me to write a review of that, and then use my name in an ad as if it would sell somebody else's book. Um, Gary, I'm occasionally exchange emails with, but that's been a while. We're friends at Facebook. Um, I don't keep contact with any of the attorneys. Um,
Do they
Michael
all have a
Stepanian was
do they all have a
it's,
positive experience on it, or do they have a negative experience on dealing with the lawsuits and everything like that?
um, I think they all enjoyed being part of it. It was a great show, even this, the straight lawyers. Um, like John Lavaroni, who led the defense for the Disney attorneys at his firm's law site, put that as his biggest, the highlight of his career was the proudest moment or biggest achievement was that he was pretty straight guy. Um, yeah.
Well, Bob, is there a place where people can find any of your links? Is there a place you'd like to promote your Twitter or anything like that?
Um, www.theboblevin, Levin, all one word.com is my what do you call it, website. And you can order books that I've written from me there. I'm not selling the Air Pirates book anymore because the only way I get copy, it's out of print, and I have to go online to buy a used copy and then mark it up and sell it to somebody else, and they can get it just as well buying it directly. So, and the same with my second book, which is a collection of articles about cartoonists. I am due to have a new book out from Fantagraphics, a collection called what's it called? Messiahs, Meshuggahs, Madmen, Mysteries, and other stories of other comic stuff. Maybe later this year. Keep your eye out for that one.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.